My friend and colleague Bill Woodburn has been a counselor and a family therapist for more than 30 years. In his private practice or presenting in workshops, he has enjoyed helping people explore the difficult art of being human. For the past 20 years, he has practiced shamanism and looked for ways to integrate shamanic ideas and practices into his work. He is interested in the shamanism of the here and now, learning from the ancestors but practicing in the culture with the technology that we have at the present. Unfortunately, as we learned in the editing process, my microphone was not working well throughout the video. There is unfortunately no way to recapture the magic of this conversation, so we've done what we can to address the sound. Fortunately for us, Bill's microphone was working very well. Here is our conversation about a shamanic view of trauma and healing. All right, I'd like to reintroduce you to a friend and colleague of mine, Bill Woodburn, who is a licensed counselor here in the Austin, Texas area. His licensure is LPC LMFT, and we have previously done a podcast together specifically about the shamanic journey and the psychology around that, perhaps the mythology around that. So we wanted to take a look today at something that's up for both of us, and that is that the idea of working with trauma from a shamanic perspective. So with that, let me just sort of say hello, Bill, and welcome. Glad to see you again. And I'm really glad that we're going to be able to touch on this particular topic today as well. So with your permission, let's just sort of dive right in and see what shows up.
Great. I'm really happy to be talking with you again.
Yeah, thanks. Now, I'm going to start with a really basic question. It's usually like this long, but the answer is like that big. Mm-hmm. And the question is, what is trauma? What would you say?
I'm going to give a very simple explanation, and then let's expand it from there. On one hand, trauma is anything that overwhelms our neurobiological emotional system. It's about overwhelm. It's too much, something that is too much for us to handle. And a lot of us have all sorts of words about, I'm on my last nerve. I've just done too much. Too much is coming at me. There are a lot of things because it's a pretty common human experience for something in life to be too much. And most of us, it's a little like when we say we're hungry and we say we're starving, but we're not really starving. We just missed lunch. Well, trauma is, what if you were really starving? What if your system was really at the end of its resources? What if you could no longer defend against the emotional, neurological, biological impact of something that was a threat, something that was a fear, something that looked like it was going to kill you or mutilate you, and that would be something that would end up being traumatic. By the way, I forgot something that we need to put in right about here.
Okay, please go right ahead.
I want to put in a trigger warning for those who have been through trauma, that there's no way for me to talk about trauma without talking about it. But please take care of yourself. You really may need to stop the podcast at any particular time. You may need to end the podcast. That's okay. It's important for you to be safe and for you to be okay with this. The other is, I also have to say that this is not therapy or intending to be therapy. Hopefully it's an introduction to trauma and to shamanism that will help you seek the help that you need and know a little bit more about how to get good help. And that's all I'm really intending here.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate those caveats there. So please continue. You were talking about trauma. I think you did the small trauma description, and you're about to go into the big one.
Yeah. The thing that's tricky about trauma, and it's kind of embodied in that question I get from a lot of people, is, how much trauma is enough to cause some sort of emotional damage, some sort of mental health issue, A lot of my clients will say, "Well, I'm not sure that this was enough. I'm not sure that was enough." How much trauma? And in a way, I want to correct that gently. That as far as effect of trauma, it isn't quantitative. It isn't about amount. It's a qualitative thing. It's the quality of the trauma. Particularly, there are other factors that make something that is threatening or difficult or emotionally overwhelming worse or better. I remember that the Navy did a study on the emotional effects of carrier landings on the crews of the planes. And they found that the pilots had a lot of neurological activity, almost to overwhelm level, when they were landing one of these jets on a carrier, a very exacting and dangerous thing to do. But that afterwards, they got over it very rapidly, and they were fine. The weapons officer sitting in the back seat would often go through some of the same sorts of emotional threat and sense of intensity, and it took them a lot longer. And sometimes they had trouble getting over a particularly difficult landing or particularly dangerous landing. And the key point was the pilot has a sense of control,
Mm.
and the weapons officer a few feet behind feels helpless at that moment. And it really underlined one of the really major pieces of what makes a trauma long lasting versus something that is a speed bump that causes us some pain and disorientation. But as human beings, there are things that do that, and we kind of get it all back together, and we get our balance back, and we go on. And then some things we don't. The degree of helplessness, the degree of how much in control we are, makes a huge difference on whether the trauma is going to be a lasting effect or something that we can recover from pretty rapidly.
Yeah, I seem to remember a study that was done in psychology where they had two monkeys in a cage, and it was set up so that they both received a shock. But one of the monkeys had a thing that he could switch, you could slap it, and the shock would stop.
Mm-hmm.
But the other monkey didn't.
Yeah.
And so the second one was completely reliant on the one with the switch to stop the shock. And so it was the other one that went neurotic because they didn't have any control, and it was at random, and there was nothing they could do.
Yes, yeah. Well, first, poor monkeys. Secondly, that's a real good, really clear example of how a piece of trauma, of the effect of trauma, is based on how much control we have. And when you're really, really helpless and you're enduring trauma, it can be far more overwhelming, and the effects can last far longer than if you are able to do something about it, to mitigate it, to fight back, or whatever sense of using your own power versus being helpless and just being at the mercy of some person or thing or nature or whatever.
I like to throw in another example. It's a more personal example from whenever I was working in the corporate world. One of our jobs was, when I was in marketing, one of our jobs was to do a review of products and services and marketing and making suggestions and things like that. And our presentation was to this very abusive senior vice president who was in charge of his own kingdom. And our job was to basically tell him that some things that he was doing wasn't working right, that he could do other things instead. And in the context of that event, in his office at a table where I was sitting in a corner and he was across from me, and he had two people on either side of him, and I was trapped.
Mm-hmm.
And he pulled no punches, and there was no way out.
Yes.
There was nothing I could do to say stop this. There was nothing I could do to get up and leave. Mm-hmm. And so it just sort of like dropped in on me, and it took me quite a while to get over that. And obviously, I still remember it.
Sure.
Right? I can go there.
Yeah.
So that situational kind of trauma is not necessarily what a lot of people think of as trauma, but it's like you can find yourself in that situation and completely unawares. And it doesn't have to be physical, and it doesn't have to be, you know, um, what people ordinarily think of as trauma as I run into them.
And that's a very accurate example, because notice how it happened to you on a variety of levels. And one of the things that impacts how overwhelming a trauma is on how many levels. One, there was the social level. You couldn't, talk back to the vice president. He outranked you. He could override you. He had more social power than you did. But also there was that physical feeling of actually being physically trapped. You couldn't get up. You couldn't move back and forth. And the fact that he had more guys on his team can be experienced also as a physical threat. So you had the physical and you had the social, and plus you were I thought I heard you sort of in charge of selling this and doing this. It was an important project, and so your self-esteem was on the line. So all of a sudden, I'm realizing that took it from I just don't like this guy and it's going to be unpleasant to wait a minute, this is starting to be overwhelming because I'm helpless on 3 or 4 different human levels here.
And that's true. And I appreciate that larger frame, because in my brain, it's a very specific singular event. But as you just described, it happened on so many different levels that I hadn't even noticed that before. And I think a lot of traumas are like that. It's like it looks like one thing, but it's really a lot of things, and sometimes based on our history.
One of the reasons why in World War II they called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, they called it combat fatigue, was actually fairly accurate, because it tended to happen to men who were exhausted, literally physically exhausted, who've had very little sleep, who had been in the cold or the heat, who'd had little or bad food, and it was much easier to overwhelm their biological system at that point. Remember, that's a piece of this too. It's not just all emotion; it's biological, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual are all of a piece here. And so, if you haven't had sleep in 2 or 3 nights, and then you go into combat, it's going to have a huge effect, because you just don't have the body to withstand it as well as you might.
Great. I appreciate that tie-in too. I have so many things I want to talk about right now. It's like we just went off in 3 different directions, and I only have one channel, right? So let me just ask a possibly obvious question. And you mentioned lack of sleep. Mm-hmm. Is there something, or are there things that help us to be a little more resilient in a traumatic situation, or more resilient in dealing with or working with trauma?
Sure. Well, let's take this in different compartments, though. As human beings, they're all connected. But let's talk about physical. If we're exhausted, if we're having sleep problems, if we are hurt, if we're in pain from some particular reason, if our diet is way off and our body is just struggling to make it, it leaves us much more open to having something happen that will overwhelm us. Because again, we just don't have the biological side that we need to be able to push back and to hold our own. So one line of defense on resilience is just good old bodily health, and having some sort of sense of balance in your diet, in your sleep, in your exercise. I mean, everyone knows this, but a lot of times we don't realize that that's part of our resilience to the shocks of life, because they often come in on a biological level, on a body level, and we need to have some sort of biological body defense to be able to cushion that when it occurs. I'd much rather be if I was going to be in a fist fight, I'd much rather be a boxer who is in excellent physical condition before I walk in the ring than just me walking in the ring right now. My body could not withstand it, whatever the emotional side was. So another piece of it, of course, is the emotional resilience. And one of the biggest things that undermines our emotional resistance is a sense of shame, a sense of guilt. In other words, that sort of undermining of ourselves that occurs and is really common in our culture. I sadly often see parents who sometimes intentionally, mostly unintentionally, have learned to use shame as part of parenting, usually from their parents, usually unconscious. But what they're doing is they are making their child less resilient to some emotional overwhelm that comes by. Because we have to have some sense of our worth that's in place to be able to withstand an emotional trauma, which is usually around something that makes us feel worthless or helpless. Much easier to push back if we already have some sense of our own worth.
Mm.
Anything that undermines that is going to decrease our resilience and going to leave us again open on that area to something coming in that direction and being overwhelming.
So with that in mind, are there practices or things that we can do to help support or, phrase of grow our resilience?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Well, one of the things to grow emotional resilience, and I know um, it's a little transactional, but I like it, is to think of our self esteem, our self worth, like an emotional bank account. That throughout the day we do activities that can make deposits. This podcast, I'm enjoying it. I feel like I'm contributing to the community. It's actually making deposits into my self esteem account. Now, we live in a modern world where there are times that we have to make withdrawals from a self esteem account. Situations where you can't talk back to someone who's more powerful, or it's just not a good idea to cause trouble if you're in line at some bureaucracy and you just need the damn form signed. There are times that we have to kind of bite our tongues, pull back, not express ourselves, not stand up for ourselves, perhaps. Now, those happen. And if we have enough in the account to cover it, we're going to be okay. But if you don't have much self-esteem in the account, because either you have a life that does not give you many deposits of self-esteem, or you're sadly one of those people that has grown up thinking you should not accept deposits into your self-esteem account, you may be overdrawn when you end up in a situation where you can't really tell the boss what you really think right there, and you just have to handle it. Oops, now that's going to hurt because you don't have enough in the account to cover it.
Mm.
Now, that's kind of silly, but in a way, I think it's really true that as far as we can work on resilience every day, and we need to save it up before we need it. Sometimes people will say, "Well, there's this thing going on at work. What do I do to get more resilient?" It's like, well, you start like 2 weeks ago.
Right,
you
right,
know,
right.
you started as a practice. You started as a daily practice of those things you know that help you be affirmed in your self-worth. And you cut out some of those things in your life or people in your life that really like to tell you you're not worth much.
Would you say that it's something like daily practice, or at least a consistent practice, something like that, where you do something that helps to fill that account? Or
Yes.
and I
Yeah.
like that, by the way. That's a good analogy.
And I would say a daily practice. Um, you know, moving over into the spiritual, it's important for me every day to call the directions, to acknowledge the directions. It's a simple thing. It's not especially. It doesn't take a long time, and I don't go especially deep in some sort of journey. But notice what I'm doing is if I do that every day, I'm keeping my resilience topped up. I'm keeping my self esteem topped up. I'm staying connected. One of the things that we know sadly from people that want to brainwash or torture people or hurt them is one of the first things they do is isolate people. Well, it's
Mm.
much easier to overwhelm and traumatize someone who's isolated. If they're in a group that is supportive, it's really hard to do that. So that the more we're connected, to each other, the more we sit in circle with each other, the more I am connected to the directions of my spirit guides, my ancestors. See, all of those are connections I can take with me through the day. Makes it much harder to knock me off balance, much harder to traumatize.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I talk about it as like leaning into community when you need it also. So you kind of carry your support system with you as you remember them and remember those connections.
But there's also something that we're starting to touch on. There's a spiritual kind of resilience that has been practiced for thousands of years, uh, which is to have some sort of larger purpose, something that gets you outside yourself. Uh, it can be just the practice of gratitude, to be grateful to Mother Earth that I'm here and I've got a day to do something in, is actually, it sounds like, oh, that's a nice spiritual practice. It's also part of resilience. It's also part of me prepping for those knocks that life sends my way. That it's okay to, and it's a good idea to have some sort of regular spiritual life. Occasionally, and sadly, there are groups around that seem to take away or damage people's spiritual lives, and they leave them hugely open for trauma and hugely open for long lasting trauma because things seem very overwhelming because I have no larger purpose. One of the classics is, if you're only doing it for the money, you're kind of at prey to, if things go wrong or you fail or the boss gets mad at you, you don't have a lot left to go on. It was my privilege to know a guy who was on the ground control team for the Apollo missions. And he said no matter how bad it got, boss was a jerk, or they had to work late, or sometimes they had to work around the clock, or he had to get back out of bed at 5 in the morning after going to bed at 2 in the morning. He said didn't hurt him, didn't make a difference because we were going to the moon. And every time something bad happened, it's like, no, but we're going to the moon, and I am part of that. And it meant that even though he went through a lot of very difficult times to do that over a set of years, they didn't hurt him any more than momentarily. He didn't save it up because he had some larger, very spiritual purpose going on in his life, something that it was all for, and it made a huge difference.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I'm thinking of several things in my life as well that sort of could have gone sideways pretty easily, but because I had somebody to fall back on, it didn't. So yeah, thanks very much for all that discussion. I want to wind back a little bit to one of those threads that I mentioned earlier that I couldn't go down. We talk about in shamanic healing that shamanic healing is healing in all the realms. It's physical, it's emotional, it's intellectual, and it's spiritual. And I sort of have come to the conclusion, and I'd like you to check me on this one if I'm wrong, because it's big for me. And that is that a lot of trauma, one of the reasons why, and I want to back up again and mention this. Whenever I'm sitting with someone, I will often ask them if they've ever been in therapy. Mm-hmm. And often as not, just about everybody that I see is, yes, I have been in therapy, sometimes many times. We talk about what that was like and so on. And then it's like, well, did it work? Was it really helpful? And almost always they'll say something like, it helped to a certain point. And then it was just talk. So my observation after that is that trauma is more than just that. Trauma is a soul wound. It's like it hurts your soul. And if it doesn't, if the work doesn't get to that level, then you're just talking. Yeah. And that may or may not be helpful. Sometimes just talking is helpful, but sometimes it's not all you need. Am I sort of on track with that?
Well, I certainly agree. I have some interns who are young counselors who are trying to learn how to do it. And one of the things that I talk frequently about, I probably bore them with it, as a matter of fact, is that, you know, counseling is a good thing, but counseling, if it's in a sacred space, works better. That there is something about, acknowledging a sacred space, keeping safe a sacred space that allows people to take in things deeper and more spiritually. Even if we're not technically doing a lot of spiritual things, you can help people let it in a different way by how you prepare the space and how you make it work. So sometimes, sadly, some of my colleagues are not actually very good at the idea of a sacred space, and they'll say, "I don't know why. It just doesn't seem to be effective past a certain point." Well, because you got through all the practical stuff, and then you wanted to shift to the spiritual stuff, and you didn't really have a space to do that in.
Mm.
And then I know plenty of colleagues who are wonderful at making a sacred space, and they say, "I'm not really quite sure what I did, but things got better." And I said, "Well, you did it in a sacred space, and
Mm.
that's a big plus."
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I had the opportunity to visit with a therapist at Fort Hood, and we were up there doing a presentation, some kind of, I don't remember. He took us into his office at one point, and I looked over at a bookshelf that he had, and on the bookshelf there was a medicine wheel and stones. And basically, he said, "Yeah, there's that, and don't tell anybody," because in that context, that was not okay.
Sure.
So he had to be a little sneaky about it. But I think that just his having that there as a reminder to himself, if nobody else, then his work with what he referred to often as the tigers in the room
Yes.
was very enhanced. And so I think just about anything that we can do, however small, that brings in some sacredness into that room, into that space, is helpful. Now, I don't know if he does any ritual around that. I didn't ask him. It seemed inappropriate at the time. But I do have that experience where some of the people that I've known bring little bits and pieces in, like another woman who has a drumming track in the background, very low, very quiet, but it's often quite soothing, and it helps to open her client's intuitive faculty, for lack of a better term. So there's technology that's behind the rhythm of drumming, which is very shamanic, and another way that we can bring in a consistent way our spirituality into the moment and carry it into our lives as well. I think my personal effort is to help people to understand how they can bring shamanic or spiritual practices into their everyday life and not reserve it for twice on Sunday and once on Wednesday. So I think that helps with the resilience as well.
One of the things I love to do is be with a group. Maybe it's not particularly spiritual, and tell stories, because stories have that sort of they create that sacred space just in telling the story, and they help us move into a more mythic understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. It's no longer me doing this. It's me as a piece of humanity, as a member of humanity that is struggling with human problems against a world that our ancestors knew as well as us. And being able to move at that level, I find far more healing in trauma than just necessarily staying with the history of the thing, which is what happened and when did it happen and what happened to you after. Those are important pieces to begin with, but I don't see the healing there. I think the healing comes in that connection that comes, and the best connection is that spiritual connection where we realize that we're part of humanity, and that we are also, also spiritual beings, and that we're connected on a lot of levels.
So that leads me to something like the next part of our discussion. We've talked about what is trauma, and we talked about different views of trauma, different situations about trauma. We talked about 4 different realms of healing and that sort of thing. But I sometimes have people come into my office and they just basically look at me and say, "Heal me." I've done all this stuff and I'm not healed. Heal me. And I'm like, sorry, if I could do that, I'd be rich. But what, from your perspective, is healing of trauma? How do you proceed with that, and how do you know it's working? I mean, can you sort of riff on that for a bit?
So in a I like to say that healing from trauma is really coming home to ourselves. And one of the problems with trauma, and how I define it on a both a spiritual and a psychological way, is that during something that's traumatic, we lose touch with, or reject, or are driven away from an important part of ourselves. And then that part is not able to reconnect. Unfortunately, if it's some sort of trauma that goes on for years or happens often, there may be a lot of parts of ourselves that are scattered and separated. And those parts are longing to come home, but it does not feel safe until we make a safe home for ourselves and the parts of us to come back home. And sadly, often, if enough parts leave, whether again that's psychologically, spiritually, it's really hard for us to create a safe space in our lives, a safe space in our heads and our hearts. And so it's like, well, those parts are not going to come back. So with both therapy, with shamanic practice, with just sitting with someone and helping them heal, a lot of it is about making that safe home so that we can recover those parts of us that got lost in the traumatic process.
So, you've just given a very good description of what is we refer to as soul loss and soul recovery or soul retrieval. And so I kind of like to move into that because there's a couple of things that, this is my spin on it, but there's a couple of things that are pretty much shamanically oriented more than other kinds of work. One of them is the idea of soul loss and soul retrieval. I don't think they teach that in college, but they might by now. I don't know. It's been years since I was, in the classroom. Is there anything in particular, other than what you said already, that you would like to share about the idea of soul loss and soul retrieval?
Sure. Now, I come from what's called a developmental perspective. It's just the way I tend to look at people in the world. And so if something happens to us when we're 8 years old and an important part of us is lost, it's usually because that part becomes a threat in that circumstance we find ourselves. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad part. It's not a bad thing or a bad part. One of the classic parts that gets lost when people are 8 years old is the truth teller, the one that knows the truth and wants to speak the truth, and it's just not safe to do that. And so that part gets banished because if you're 8 years old and you've got a big truth teller part, one of these days it's just gonna come out. And so to protect yourself, you send that part so far away you can't hear its voice anymore. And then it's safer, but you're poorer in spirit. Okay. And so you move on with your life and you grow older and you go through, but there's a part of you that's still back there as a truth teller and a part of you that is still functioning like an 8-year-old. And there's a part of you, even as an adult, that when you come to that moment of truth telling as an adult, find you can't do it because that skill got left behind and didn't develop with you. Some skills did, good judgment. Okay, great. And now I can drive and show good judgment. And that's great. That's nice. But if it was my ability to tell the truth, or my ability to stand up for myself, or my ability to deal with conflict that I might have learned at 8 or 10 or 15 or whatever, and that sort of freezes and doesn't grow along with me, then one of these days I'm at work and I need to tell the truth or stand up for myself or get into a conflict, and I feel like I just can't. That developmental part just isn't there. I reach back to get that tool and the toolbox is empty. It's like, oh my gosh. So that's a way that I think that the shamanic idea of soul loss and a more psychological idea of what does it look like in real time present effect, well, it looks like we don't have a tool in our toolbox because it's lost back there somewhere.
I have got it. Really makes a lot of sense. And I have another sort of example. Actually, one of my observations with some of my clients is that they'll get into a conflict situation, say they're having a discussion, an argument with their spouse or their significant other, and then at some point in that argument, one or both begin to devolve.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they've reached a certain point in this argument, and now they're suddenly, or a little bit over just a minute or two, they stop being adults, and a 6-year-old comes up, and now you've got two 6-year-olds
Sure.
having this conflict in the park, and they often even describe it. It's like, I don't do that. That's not who I am. It's like they got knocked back here, and now they're watching the 6-year-old, and there's nothing they can do. Once the 6-year-old takes over, the only thing they can do is put themselves in timeout. I mean, does that sound accurate?
Oh, it sounds very accurate, because that's that other thing that happens with a lost part of us. Is one possibility is, we reach back and the toolbox is empty, and we don't know what to do. But the other is we left it back when we were 6, and we go back to 6 to get that tool. Only it hasn't grown since 6 because it didn't come along with us. And so to use that tool, we sort of become 6 again, because that's what it is. It never grew to be 35, 40, 50 years old and be that kind of tool. It's still a 6-year-old tool, but it's maybe the only one we've got. And so we go back there and grab it. And if our partner, has got a 7-year-old tool, well, they go back and get that. And now we got a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old arguing. And it really looks like that. Again, though, that's not because these people are crazy. That's where the tool is, and they went back for
it. Yeah, and then I have one more story. Then I'm going to ask you a bit more about what soul retrieval looks like from your perspective. One of the things that I've noticed is that whenever a soul part is returned to my client, it often has a gift. And you spoke about like this younger part. There was the truth teller. Here's a true story. Whenever I was a kid living in Columbus, Georgia, and I remember how old I was, we were playing football, baseball, something. And after the game was over, I was on my bicycle, and we lived about a half block away from the playground. And so my parents were there in their car. Okay, so I jump on my bicycle, and I just tear off down the road because I'm going to win. I'm going to beat my parents home. And lo and behold, I was doing that. I was going really, really fast, and they were still behind me. And so I'm winning. And so I go around the corner, and then there's this car right in front of me. And I hit that car square on. And I still remember sliding up the hood and looking in the windshield at these two horrified people, and then sliding back down to land on my bicycle. Miraculously, I was not hurt, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I lost a part of myself in that accident.
Sure.
And I discovered that in a soul retrieval process years later, decades later, when I went back to that playground, and I found myself endlessly going around the merry-go-round, because we also played on merry-go-round a lot. It was completely alone, nobody else there, and just going around and around and around on the merry-go-round. So anyway, long story short, did the process to bring that soul part home. And the thing is that what I noticed not too long after that is that the part that was there was joy. that excitement of I'm winning. I'm at the height of my game. I was joyful. But since then, I did not know what joy was. I knew what happiness was. And I knew what being very happy was. But the concept of joy was completely elusive. I didn't understand it at all until that soul part returned. And boy, whenever I first felt joy, it was painful. It was so joyful that it hurt. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my story about the gift of soul retrieval. And I often find that happens for clients as well. It's like they've lost something and they can bring it forward. And then the work starts to reintegrate that part into their everyday lives. And so that's kind of how I look at it. Is that accurate?
Well, you have such a powerful image of that part of you just circling, on the playground. And one of the pieces that I found over and over again is those parts of us that become detached or rejected or often become very sad and very lonely. And people will say, sometimes I cry and feel lonely and I don't know why. Well, because they got in touch with that part which is still feeling alone. And if it's a child part that is circling on a playground, or one of my clients, their part was a part that was waiting at school for the parent to come and pick them up, and waited and waited, and it got dark and they just waited and waited. And they said, sometimes I just feel so sad and alone and bereft, and I don't know why, because I got a nice family, I got a good job. Well, it's that part inside is still feeling that way, and hasn't been brought along, and hasn't been given the other pieces of life, has never been rescued, has never been picked up from school, has never made it home from the playground. And so some of healing is allowing that part of us to both reconnect, but also to reconnect with things like joy and safety. And there is another piece to soul retrieval in a psychological sense. Some traumas are really pretty horrific. And what happens is that part becomes not just left behind, but rejected, because it's frightening and it feels really bad for us to even know about that part, or go back to that part, or see that part, much less try to bring it along or make contact, or bring it back into our lives. Just knowing that part is there is frightening and disturbing.
Who would want to go back there?
Who'd want to go back there? Because some parts are back on the playground and some parts are stuck at school, but some parts are stuck back in really horrible places that nobody wants to go back to. And my clients will literally say, I don't want to go back there. As well, fine, but there's a part of you that's stuck back there. If we're talking about soul retrieval, you kind of have to go where it is. And sometimes that's in the middle of the deep, dark forest, and there are monsters in there. And it takes some serious courage to go into the forest and find that part that either got left behind or hid from us, or we couldn't handle it and we purposely left it behind.
And I was thinking about a client, a veteran that I worked with for a while. And as he was nudging into an event that he really needed to deal with, I remember him saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. And he was crying, and it was painful to see. Mm-hmm. And so I gave him the opportunity to back out for a while if he wanted to. And he says, I don't want to do it, but I got it. And his healing was remarkable. But because he had the courage to go back and visit that again. And that leads me to two topics. One of them is, I know, or at least I believe, that therapists are often told to do everything possible not to re-traumatize your client.
Yes.
And I get that. But where that goes to, and I don't have this kind of experience, so that's why I'm asking, where that goes to is avoidance of these really awful places where people might need to go, it seems to me. It's like, there it is. Okay. Well, there
It
it is.
depends. It depends on your definition of trauma. I want to go back. This is a nice time to go back to that original thing. If I, as a therapist, took someone back not just into that awful place, but into that powerless state in that awful place, that would be re-traumatizing. But what if the adult self, with all their power, both physical and emotional and spiritual, goes back there, or goes back with a powerful ally? Someone I have worked with before, she goes back with Joan of Arc in full armor, not right next to her. She does not go back powerless, and so she's not going to be re-traumatized. It's going to be a different sort of feeling, a different sort of outcome. If you pull your sword and go charging back in to rescue a part of you, a rescue mission is different than going through another helpless rendition of that same thing that happened in childhood. So I much prefer rescue missions than just reenacting another defeat.
Yeah, boy, that's a good reframing. I appreciate that very much. The idea of a rescue mission makes a lot of sense, and it fits with what I was told about soul retrieval. Is you don't ever want to retrieve and bring back the trauma. You want to retrieve and bring back the part before the trauma, where they were whole.
Some clients will come in and say, I need to get this fixed, and we'll talk about it, and they may just not be powerful enough to go get that part right now. Sometimes it's let's get your life straightened out, let's get things better for you, let's get you more interpersonal power or spiritual power, and then we'll address that again, because your sword's not sharp enough to go back now. You can't battle those monsters.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate that. And that leads to another really interesting question. I don't know if we've discussed this before, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. And this may be another one of those points where you say trigger warning. Turn off if you feel like you need to. But I'm very curious of the issue of flashbacks, because we've probably both experienced people having flashbacks, and what is that about? What is it? How do you look at that, other than just sort of making the person feel safe, and how do you use that therapeutically? That's a big question, and I don't know whether this is a big enough venue to handle that or not. But what do you think?
Well, let me give a couple of things. The problem with a flashback is, by definition, we're helpless. We get just thrown back into something. That's what makes it difficult. That's what makes it wounding. It's very different to go on a prepared rescue mission versus one day to be walking down the street and find ourselves re-feeling, re-seeing, rehearing some piece of something that wounded us. And the thing that is awful there is that feeling that we have lost control, that we're doing it whether we want to or not, whether we're prepared to or not. And sadly, often flashbacks happen when, as human beings, we're tired, we're hungry, we're alone, we're exactly in the wrong spot to have any kind of successful rescue mission. And so the harm for flashbacks is the fact that we get pretty helpless in the face of them.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And that the helplessness is a huge component of that, which is quite different from what I refer to as blips. So you just have this memory, and it's like a fleeting thing. It's like, oh, as opposed to, I'm back in that war. Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So, like one of my clients who, he says his big goal, he spent too many tours in Afghanistan, so his big goal is he wants to walk down the street in Austin without checking the rooftop for snipers. And he really tries, but he is real prone. Like the other day, he came in and he was looking at the rooftops, and there was a glint from something at a rooftop, and he said he felt his heart try to come up through his mouth. He thought it was a big success because he didn't actually hit the ground, but his entire system was just ravaged the rest of the day. Balance was unattainable And he said until like 9 o'clock that night, when finally he was able to both meditate and calm down and get things back in order. Because yeah, it was part of a flashback is uh, the wonderful thing about being a human being is that we learn, and the terrible thing about being a human being is that we learn. A lot of it depends on he learned a very important lesson in a hard school, and now he can't unlearn it very easily.
Mm.
And so it's his body will react, his mind will react, his soul will react um, from that learning that's very deep, and it's going to take him a while to get past that.
Yeah, that's a great example. Um, and so far what we've been talking about um, could be referred to more as as acute trauma. And
Mm,
something happens, and then you have this reaction, and then trauma thing, and then you go all this. But there's different kinds of trauma as well. There's like more trauma, like where you get up every day and it's a whole new world, and you might die that day. So that's day after day after day. It's systemic.
mhm,
And I see childhood trauma pretty much the same way. It's like you get up, you have no power, you're at the mercy of the people who are supposed to be taking care of you and may not be, right? So there's kind of a systemic trauma
sure.
that I keep going back to, the idea of how similar it is to war trauma.
Mhm. See, one of the things that's easy to recognize are these major spikes in harm or threat as part of trauma. It's much harder to realize that, well, in our society, not everybody's got the same amount of power. And sometimes there are small systemic things day after day after day after day for an entire lifetime that produced a trauma. And maybe they never went into battle, and maybe nobody ever shot at them from a concealed position, or a explosive device went off under their Jeep or whatever. Those are those big spikes. But what about just being reminded over and over again that you do not have the power to speak the truth, to get something that you want, to defend those that are precious to you, over and over again? That's traumatic. It takes longer, but it's in some ways far more pervasive and far more difficult to heal.
That's true. And I see that a lot. And part of what I see with that is that people will come in and they'll say, well, yeah, but my family life wasn't all that bad. There are people in Somalia who have it much worse, and, I was just like all the other families around me. Nonetheless, if you sort of drill down into that, and they were living in an unsafe home with poverty or any number of things that a child would find to be traumatic and not even know, because they have no context. They don't have any way to evaluate how awful their situation might be, right?
Mhm.
So that does make it more difficult. And so I want to switch gears real quickly.
Sure.
And something related to that is the idea of generational trauma, because it may not be something that's going on like right here. It may also be something that I've learned or picked up from my parents, and then my parents and their parents, and from their parents on back. And with some of my clients, I've traced it back many generations where they were never quite able to either recognize
Sure.
or deal with the situations that they found themselves in. And can you speak to that?
Well, easily, because you and I are from the same generation that had parents that went through the Great Depression, and I lay you odds that neither one of us see money quite like someone whose parents had plenty of money all the time and never had to go through that. And we may not even know because it's just the way we were raised. But it was in the shadow of their childhood of uncertainty, and uh, if they didn't go into poverty, the next door neighbors did, and that sort of sense. Um, my other story about that is I was doing a workshop and working with some people using psychodrama, and a young woman came up and said, my problem is that I just don't hang on to guys. They'll be great guys. We'll have a good relationship, and I'll just sort of let them go. I just become uninterested. It's just they're just not that important. And weeks before they had become vitally important, and I loved them. I truly did, but I just let them go. We began to work on legacy, that generational trauma, because she didn't have any particular trauma except for these relationships that weren't working out. She knew a lot of a family history, so we went back. Her mom did the same thing, but no obvious trauma. We had to go all the way back to her great grandmother who lived through the Civil War. And her great grandmother's experience was all the young men you love go off to war and they don't come back. You've got to get out there in the fields and you've got to raise the crop and you've got to tend the animals and you've got to make it through. And guys are nice and you love them, but don't hang on to them because they're only temporary and they're just not coming back. Now, it wasn't like that was said down through the generations, but that was taught down through the generations.
Mhm.
And so it comes to my client and she says, I don't know why I do this, but it is so automatic. It just feels like I have to, just the way the world is. It'll just start before I even think about it. I thought, yeah, that's the sign of generational trauma. It's not trauma in your lifetime. It could be trauma in one of the lifetimes of your parents. It could go very far back. Entire countries and cultures have generational trauma that they are living. And so it's things that are handed down and they're really hard to fix because often we don't even know why we're reacting that way because it wasn't our trauma. It's as though our part of ourselves isn't lost. And so we look and say, no, all the parts are here. I don't know why this keeps happening. Well, there is a part of the culture or the community that got banished. And so we never knew that part, whether that was how to sustain a long-term relationship with a guy, or for you and I, how to have productive relationships with money that don't involve a little sort of uncertainty and that little fear of like, do I have enough?
Mhm.
It becomes really hard.
Yeah, I fortunately traced some of that through my parents and grandparents and on. Whenever I started noticing that whenever I was younger, I would get to a certain amount of money
Mhm.
that I felt comfortable, and then something would happen and it'd all go away. And I'd build up to that same level, it would all go away. And so I was doing the cycle over and over again. I began to wonder about that. And then it came to me that my grandfather on my mother's side, he was an orphan. He was one of 13 children who were orphaned, right? So he never really had any kind of parenting at all.
Mhm.
But he and my grandmother married when they were 13 or something like that. It was really, really early. I got a whole nother story about that. But what he would do for a living was that he would load a refrigerator onto his truck and he would leave, drive to all these farms, and he would not come home until he sold the refrigerator. And he'd come back home, he'd load up another one and go out again. So he sold religious refrigerators from the back of his truck to make money, and they were dirt poor.
Mhm.
So my parents, my mother and our sister learned about that, learned how it was not to have money, and then they go into the depression, right? And so I wonder why my mother had four of everything in the kitchen, right? Because she was really afraid that something was all going to go away. Now, that was not taught to me. That was something I learned as a child just from being with them. You know what I mean? It's like
Mhm.
there's no book about relationships. So we learn about relationships from our parents. We learn about relationships with money, with people, with places, and et cetera, et cetera. So um, generational trauma is really something.
Yeah, and that's actually hard to fix psychologically, though it is something. It helps if you can get the history, if you have some people still alive, or you're willing to go through the history. Um, it really helps a lot if you can shamanically go back historically and begin to pick up some pieces. Um, Many people, I think, have just generational trauma that don't even know they've got it because again, it's not their trauma, so they can't trace it back to something that happened to them. And so they're like, I don't know why I feel this way. I feel a little crazy. It just happens.
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt for a little while. It's like, why is this happening? What did I do wrong in my past life?
Well, I've often wondered how much, particularly American masculinity, is influenced by the fact that in the middle of the 20th century, uh, we had almost 13 million men go off to war. Many of them were actually in fighting and in combat, and many more in some form of deprivation, uh, as far as food or whatever. And what does that do if you take somebody who's 19, 20, 22, and you send them through that experience, and they come home, and then they have to raise a son? What do they teach him? What do they teach him, even accidentally, about the world and about how the world is and how the world should be? What would it have been like if those men had not gone to war, had stayed home, raised families, had a good job, or worked a successful farm or whatever, and passed that on to their son?
Mm, yeah, true. I think I may be getting to the end of my questions, but you know me, I've always got questions. But I'd like to see if we can take a few moments and tie a few loose ends together. Been talking a lot about trauma. We talked about systemic trauma, and we talked about generational trauma, and so all of this, and we looked at it from kind of two different perspectives, kind of from the psychological perspective and kind of from the spiritual perspective. So is there a way that you can simplify or help us understand the relationship between the psychological approach and the spiritual approach or the shamanic approach to actually addressing what I referred to earlier as a soul wound, which is how I see trauma. So I'd like to just give you the floor and see what you can do with that.
Well, I'm really happy because over the past, I'd say, 10 years, there's actually been recognition in some of the psychological literature of the idea of what we in shamanic practice would call a lost soul part. Internal family systems, parts work, some other things have shown up where people are actually beginning to develop techniques to do that. And it's not as much the techniques, but the recognition that we, in fact, do lose parts during trauma. I think that's really fundamental. It's also where I think shamanic practice and shamanic ideas can really benefit the community. Is we've got some very good ideas about what happens during trauma and what is necessary to help heal it, and being able to put those out there, and I think fairly boldly, because I think they're very well grounded. I think they really do work, and I think that we're not being dogmatic about it, but they are things that we've experienced working before, and I think we can be pretty open and honest about that. It's a soul wound, and that soul parts break off, and that wholeness and balance are what health's about. And so the sooner we can gather up the parts, make a safe place for them to be together until they can reintegrate, the sooner that we can, help people go on rescue missions for those parts that are in truly awful places and bring them out successfully and boldly and without losing power or trading off power. Those, I think, are workable, fantastic things. I like to try to put them out there with my colleagues. I think that some places in psychology are ready to hear about that, and I think it's reasonable as shamanic practitioners for us to discuss it, and discuss it very much that way, and not have to cloak it even too much in psychological language.
Thank you. That's a good summary there. So like I said, I'm kind of at the end of my list of curiosities. Is there anything that you would like to add before I bring our experience together to an end?
One of the things that I hope people have heard in this is that trauma comes in on different channels: physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. And that sounds overwhelming, and trauma feels by its nature overwhelming, but it is something that can be healed. The dangerous piece, the sad piece here, is sometimes that sense of being overwhelmed goes with us the rest of our lives. And we think, well, this could never be healed. I could never be different or better, more in balance. My soul could never be knit back together again. And I want people to hear that that's the echo of that original helplessness. It's not accurate to what is now. It is possible to heal. It's possible to heal now in ways that it was not possible back when the original trauma was happening. And so I don't want our discussion of trauma to make it into such a big monster that can't possibly be handled. If you feel helpless in relationship to the trauma you suffered, particularly as a child, remember that that helplessness was based on who you were then, not who you are now.
Thank you. That's most excellent. So again, I've been having a wonderful discussion with my friend and colleague, Bill Woodburn, who is LPC LMFT licensed counselor here in Austin, Texas. So Bill, I have a suspicion we'll be visiting again at some point.
Oh, I hope so.
Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And for anyone who's watching this video, it was wonderful to share with you. Okay. Take care. Be well, be safe.
Bye.
Bye.